So now that we've essentially touched on structure, the next sort of piggyback topic that correlates directly with structure is going to be supply and demand and how we utilize it within the Fractal Markets Discord server and premium membership program. So very, very simply put, there are essentially only two variations of supply and demand that we really use at our core, and these are at extremes as well as flip zones. You'll hear us talk about interaction zones. That's essentially just an interaction between demand and supply, pushing one direction or the other. No two variables can be in control at the same time. We always look at the higher time frame trend and correlate what's happening with those trends. So if you were to look right now at our examples leading from left over to right, what I'm going to talk about is the basics of an extreme supply being created. So essentially anytime that we have a break of structure, ideally we want to see a swing structure break to create a new low, swing structure high, swing structure low, etc. The most probable areas for us to look for high quality trades that correlate with supply in this specific case are going to be at the extremities, right? Most of you guys may be already familiar with premium and discount, right? Which is essentially we're only looking for supply zones that are in the upper half of the actual structural leg that is put in. So this is an idea, or an example rather, of the extreme being mitigated, and the idea is that supply will control the market from here to then take out demand levels that rest in here on lower time frames to continue on the expectational order flow. So that's basically extremes, and then getting into a little bit fancier stuff, which is the flip zones. So essentially every time that we put in a leg, we push back up, we come back down into where the leg should in theory break in terms of our structure mapping and order flow and what we're expecting from the market, which is obviously to break this low at some point. Oftentimes we'll get a sharp move that happens at the low, which basically gets the buyers sort of confused in the market, looking to take longs to possibly take out this level for whatever reason or another. But the idea is that there's obviously not going to be enough demand for higher price to be able to take out the high. And what will end up happening is demand will push and then break through, creating a new supply zone, right? So there's two supply zones here that we can utilize for a trade idea. The first of which would always be the demand to supply flip zone to be able to look for potential continuation trades alongside the higher time frame trend. Or of course, we could very much see an example such as this one right here, where we essentially have a push up. We do mitigate the demands to supply zone, push down, create another demand to supply zone, and then that zone actually fails. And it doesn't mean that supply in general has failed. It means that the initial place where supply can take control from has essentially failed. So oftentimes this will be used to run as liquidity to fill a larger order block to be able to push down into further pricing. So again, just two different examples of supply and demand. Demand turns into supply and fails, and it does not mean that we are now looking at this as a demand level. It just means that essentially what we're looking for is the extreme to get mitigated and give the confirmations necessary to start taking this down into new territorial lows. So demand to supply as well as extremes are the only two really high value areas that we look for. There's a couple different ways that we look at refined stuff, which we'll get into in the actual community itself on the community calls, trade recaps, case study building sessions. But for the time being, the most probable areas that we look for lower time frame confirmations to start to get involved in the actual trade come from a flip zone or an extremity. Now moving over to the bottom left, same as the top left, this is just an example of once we break structure, we push up. The theory is that demand controls the market from the entire area that pushes down and then expands out. We don't necessarily like to look at one specific candle, especially when it comes to a higher time frame move. We like to range out the entire area, watch for some form of order flow to realignment. We want to see demand start to form. And then once we start to see demand form, we can get involved to take this into a very high probability area to take out the new high. So demand, again, at the extremity is sitting right here, and it's just an example of what that would look like. Moving over to the right-hand side on the bottom, similar to the right-hand side on the top, we're just looking at a flip zone. So every time we break structure, we create a demand zone. And this is oftentimes why we look at the entire range as demand as opposed to a specific candle in here, specific candle in here, or whatever it might be, is because demand is created on the push down that expands up and not on a singular candle within any of these ranges. So in theory, the way that we look at demand is that this entire push down is our demand zone, and we'll have two refinements in here as well as in here to understand a little bit further where price can come to mitigate and be able to produce new expectational order flow highs. So in this case, obviously we have a supply that rests right here at the actual extremity, pushes in, comes back down, fails to take out at a relevant level, and pushes through, creating demand. You can see that this is known as a supply to demand flip zone that pushes through. And then I just wanted to show the same example again one last time, similar to what we saw up here, just what a failure would look like. So essentially, this is demand in here, and this is demand in here, but if you look at the push down that expands out, this is the entire demand range, and then typically what we'd like to do is measure this leg and be able to only take positions or look for positions within the lower half of the actual leg itself. So you can see that this is in the lower, this is in the lower, so both of those are valid areas. Obviously, this doesn't take into consideration liquidity concepts or any of these kinds of things, but it's just the general idea of supply and demand and how they operate within the way that we trade. So just again, one last time to make sure that we really drive this home. Anytime that we see a break of structure of any sort, typically we'd like to see a swing structure point go. So as I mentioned in the previous videos, swing structure is the strongest of all of the three structures that we typically look at. Swing low, swing high, swing low, swing high, swing low, swing high, swing low, swing high. So the idea is the push that happens before the expansion is the entire demand range. The push that happens down before the expansion is the entire range. That's where demand lies. And this is better known as order flow, and we correlate that with structure and supply and demand. So all of these things are essentially one in the same, but we use them as refining tools to be able to understand very high probable areas to start to look for potential trade ideas. So this is an example of a flip zone being met. This is an example of a flip zone not being respected and coming into demand. So just because this has broken at a decisional area at the flip zone does not mean that we're looking to trade short here. We're still looking at this extremity to essentially be met and potentially take out this all-time high.